Hey good people, and welcome back to the channel. It's hump day, and you already know what time it is. In a few moments, you'll get to hear my thoughts and feelings on episode 9 of Married at First Sight Boston. First and foremost, if you haven't seen this episode yet, then you can probably skip it and catch the YouTube reviews or catch the after party to see the highlights of the show. You've been warned. If you watched all 2 hours of this episode, then I'm glad I didn't suffer through this episode alone. Now, with Chris and Alyssa being gone for the time being, we are down to 4 couples who are all seemingly a long way away from being in a good place in their marriage. So for the purposes of this review, in 10 minutes or less, I'll give a brief recap of what happened during the episode, as well as my opinion on the conflicts that each couple faced. Lastly, I'll also give my overall rating of the episode. So without any further delay, let's jump right in. So let's start off with Steve and Noi. In the beginning of the episode, Noi invites Steve out to meet at a park. When Steve arrives, he learns that Noi planned a scavenger hunt where Steve has to read a series of notes to find out where Noi is hiding. And as Steve is participating in the hunt, we hear Noi telling the producers that she wants Steve to know that she's incredibly grateful for him, which in my opinion is a complete reversal for how she was feeling the last few episodes. And if you ask me, this reversal probably came because Noi found out that Steve is Prince Akeem reincarnated. She likely did some research and found out that Steve actually has good credit and his finances are in order for someone who doesn't have a job. And she's not trying to mess this marriage up because doing so means that she'll be back to backpacking in Europe or South America in hopes of finding love. So a significant part of this episode was considered filler, and producers gave each couple a bottle of wine as well as questions to ask each other about love. I won't go into extreme detail about Steve and Noi's conversation, but Noi admitted to being in love only once, while Steve admitted to being in love with most of the women in his serious relationships. Noi felt some type of way that Steve was in love with his previous girlfriends, but Steve is taking his time with her. In my opinion, Noi is still showing her immaturity and ability to self-sabotage. Next up is Mark and Lindsay. When we first see them in this episode, Mark is trying to make conversation, and Lindsay is giving short answers in return while having this look of being constipated on her face. They then begin to have dinner, and for a moment, it was so quiet that you could hear a mouse piss on cotton. Then out of nowhere, all we hear is sounds of pepper being cracked and silverware scraping the plates. Yes, folks, the tension was pretty thick as the two of them would only speak a few seconds, then have extremely long periods of uncomfortable silence. Then Mark finally breaks the ice and addresses the elephant in the room, which was the previous night where the two of them were at the bowling alley and they had the falling out. Mark then asks Lindsay if she felt like she was out of line for how she acted that night, and Lindsay doesn't really answer the question. She turns it around and claims that she needs affirmation from Mark. Lindsay then tells Mark that she activated her off switch and she will only be giving Mark that infamous 1% that Chris was talking about a few episodes ago. My opinion on this is that Mark and Lindsay are living in 2 completely different realities, and their strong personalities prevent them from being able to move past situations like this. Lindsay claims that Mark was the one being negative when Lindsay threw every insult that she could at Mark last episode, which, if she were a man and she said half of those things to another man, she would have gotten knocked out. So later during the filler part of their scenes, they are talking about the topic of love. Mark shares his history of being in love in past relationships, and Lindsay tells Mark what it would take for her to love him again. I'm no genius, but from the looks of things, Lindsay's words to Mark went in one ear and out the other. Now let's talk about Michael and Jasmina. Their first scene together is a picnic at a park where Mr. Feeney is also in attendance. While they're at the park, Michael presents Mr. Feeney with several gifts, and Jasmina meets this with approval. Then the topic of communication comes up, and Michael asks Jasmina how he should communicate with her. At this point, I think Michael is beating a dead horse with a stick, because last episode he asked Jasmina's friends the exact same question and they gave him an answer, but he still asked Jasmina this question and she seems annoyed with it. Jasmina informs Michael that the issues that they had with communication during the honeymoon was because Michael raised his voice at her. And in this episode, we as the audience learn that talking above the decibel level that's appropriate for the library is considered raising your voice at Jasmina. But Michael tries to counter Jasmina's point by pointing out that she raised her voice at him as well. And instead of taking accountability for her actions, Jasmina blames her actions on Michael for raising his voice first. Jasmina goes on further to tell Michael that knowing how to have a conversation with someone is basic knowledge. But in my opinion, it's not common knowledge, i.e., A person like Lindsay is harder to communicate with versus somebody like Noi. And in this particular argument, it seems like Jasmina would rather Michael acknowledge that she's right versus her trying to understand how he processes things. But later on in the filler part of the episode, Jasmina and Michael talk about the topic of love. Jasmina briefly talks about her previous relationships, and Michael talks about the one time he was in love with someone. Michael informs Jasmina that he has issues with being vulnerable, despite vowing to be vulnerable from day one of the process, and Jasmina is seemingly passing judgment on Michael for his answer. But Jasmina definitely redeems herself later on in the episode, but we'll get to that a little later. Lastly, rounding out the first hour of the episode, let's talk about Elijah and Katina. We learned that Katina and Elijah had a big argument the previous night. Elijah is discussing the incident involving him having to clean up the apartment that night. And when he's talking to Katina, the drill sergeant Elijah is back. And I'm not sure if he's testing her to see if she'll speak up for herself, or if the Elijah from the casting special is back. Either way, it was pretty hard to watch Elijah and Katina interact during the scenes, because Elijah's way of communication is extremely too harsh, and there's a way to communicate with your partner without coming off as accusatory or judgmental. But Elijah seemingly creates the conflict between the two of them, and he treats her pretty badly. In my opinion, this was an episode that desperately needed intervention from Pastor Cal, because Elijah essentially told Katina that she is not meeting his expectations and not putting forth the effort that he feels that she should. They've only been married for 2 weeks and he's tripping big time. A few episodes when Jasmina accused Michael of being aggressive with her, the interaction that we saw Elijah have with Katina tonight is how I envision what aggression looks like. And it was sad to see their marriage take a turn for the worse, because despite what Katina may lack when it comes to cooking skills, she's been nothing but supportive to Elijah, especially in times where he didn't deserve it. Now, after the 1 hour mark of the episode, there's a ton of filler for the remainder of the episode. The men and the women meet up to pretty much discuss the issues that they already been having. The women meet up to get pedicures, while the men meet up to do archery. After the group meetups, the couples go out on individual dates. Mark and Lindsay go out on a romantic date at a sushi restaurant. They have some lighthearted moments, but when Mark gets the spotlight, he assures Lindsay that he will not cause her any pain, and he appreciates her. Lindsay was straight stone-faced during most of this exchange, but she lightens up and appears to believe Mark. Later on in the episode, Jasmina sets up a gym at the apartment, and there are 3 workout stations designed to help Michael and Jasmina work on their issues in the marriage. Jasmina doesn't know a thing about personal training, but this exercise helps Mike get out of his comfort zone and see Jasmina in a different light. Sadly, I think in order for their marriage to work, Jasmina will have to take the first step and get Michael out of his own way, because I don't see him taking the initiative. And during an exercise involving vulnerability, Jasmina asks Michael to recall a time where his brother died, and Michael shares the story, and he starts to break down in front of Jasmina. But during this time, Jasmina comes closer to him, and I wish she would have held him or assured him that she had his back. I think that would have went a long way in gaining Michael's trust. Later on, Steve and Noi meet at the beach, and Steve tells Noi that he loves her. And yes, folks, this was music to Noi's ears. She was initially speechless, but she composes herself, and she gives Steve a nice kiss. Something tells me that if Steve hasn't given Noi that pickle tickle yet, then sooner than later, they'll be getting it in like 2 jackrabbits trapped in a tube sock. The episode ends with Elijah taking Katina out to a cooking class, where they both cook, but it doesn't take Elijah long to go back to his drill sergeant mode, and this causes Katina to break down and cry. And that's how the episode ends. Now on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give this episode a 3. There were some great parts of the episode, but in my opinion, they were overshadowed by the conflicts with 3 of the 4 remaining couples. And truth be told, this episode became uncomfortable to watch at times, and what we saw tonight shouldn't be what Married at First Sight is all about. But judging by the previews for next week, we as fans of the show will be in for another episode of pure foolishness. But this marks the end of my video. If you have any questions or comments, then leave them below in the comment section, and I'll be sure to respond to each and every one of them. Until next time, stay tuned and stay safe. Peace.